In a world where justice and fairness are supposed to reign, what happens when those entrusted to protect and serve turn a blind eye to the truth? This is the story of a seemingly innocent day that spirals into a shocking chain of events, revealing more than anyone could have anticipated. It all begins at a high school, where a black girl, just trying to get through her day, becomes the target of a group of teens who have no problem picking on her. But what makes this story different from any other bullying incident you've heard of is the involvement of someone who should have been there to stop it, the school's officer, a white man who, instead of standing up for the victim, sides with the bullies. At first, it seems like just another tragic tale of injustice, where power and privilege are abused to protect the wrong people. But as we dive deeper, something unexpected happens. The officer's actions aren't as straightforward as they seem. As the tension builds and the confrontation escalates, a revelation emerges that completely changes everything. What was initially perceived as a simple case of discrimination and bias soon evolves into a story of hidden motives and unforeseen twists. We start with a girl, a young woman who, despite her quiet and reserved nature, is forced to endure the cruelty of her peers. She doesn't have a voice in the halls, and the officer, tasked with ensuring her safety, offers no protection. Instead, he sides with the group of teens, dismissing her cries as if they were nothing more than the usual noise of school life. His reasoning? He claims he's only doing his job, maintaining order. But as we dig into his past, we begin to uncover small details that make us question his true motivations. Meanwhile, the teens, feeling emboldened by the officer's support, continue their relentless bullying, pushing the girl further into isolation. But the turning point comes when one of the students, caught in the act, says something that raises a red flag for everyone involved. This comment, seemingly minor at first, sends ripples through the investigation, and we begin to see that there's more to this situation than meets the eye. What is it that binds the officer to these teens? What secrets are being hidden behind closed doors? Could the officer's allegiance to the bullies be rooted in something darker, something that connects him to the very heart of the school's culture of discrimination? Or could there be an entirely different reason for his actions, one that no one could have ever predicted? As the story unfolds, the lines between right and wrong blur, and we're left with more questions than answers. What will happen when the truth finally comes to light? And who will pay the price for the lies that have been told? But before we dive into that, let's take a closer look at how everything went from bad to worse, and the shocking twist that's still to come. Stay tuned, because you won't believe what happens next. The girl, whose name was Maya, had always been quiet. She never drew attention to herself, always keeping her head down and her heart to herself. Maya's parents had taught her that people like her, black girls in predominantly white schools, had to be twice as good to be seen as equal. But no matter how hard she tried, no matter how many straight A's she earned or how polite she was, it was never enough to escape the whispers, the looks, the constant feeling that she was different. The bullying started small. At first, it was the passing comments, the snide remarks about her hair, about her skin, things that could easily be brushed off as ignorance or kids being kids. But it escalated. They'd shove her in the halls, pretend not to notice when she tripped, laugh when she stuttered on a presentation. The worst part was that it was never a single person. It was a group of them, a small but tightly knit pack of teens who seemed to take joy in pushing Maya further into the margins. They knew that as long as they stuck together, they could hide behind their numbers. And most importantly, they knew they could count on Officer Daniels. Officer Daniels was the school resource officer, a heavy-set man in his late 40s with a military buzz cut and the kind of smile that was always just a little too wide. To the students, he was more of a figurehead than a protector. He was always there, standing in the halls, walking the grounds with a kind of quiet authority that made some feel safe, but others uneasy. He rarely spoke unless spoken to, but when he did, it was usually with a stern tone. No one expected him to get involved in the everyday drama of high school students, especially not in the bullying that went on. It was just part of life, they thought. But Maya didn't see it that way. She had hoped that, for once, someone would stand up for her. Someone who wasn't a student or a teacher, but someone who had the power to stop it all, the officer. Yet, when she was shoved into a locker one day after lunch and she reported it to him, Officer Daniels had only shrugged it off with a muttered, "Kids will be kids." At that moment, Maya had felt the walls close in around her. The person who was supposed to protect her, the one who wore a badge that symbolized authority and justice, had chosen to ignore her. But what hurt more than his lack of action was the way he seemed to side with the bullies. He didn't question them. He didn't even raise an eyebrow at their laughter, their smug glances when they saw Maya's face pressed against the cold metal of the locker. He just moved on, like it was all part of the daily routine. The teens, emboldened by the officer's indifference, took it even further. They started following Maya after school, sending her harassing messages on social media, and even cornering her in the restroom, laughing at her when she refused to respond to their taunts. Maya tried to brush it off, but the fear was always there, deep in the pit of her stomach, where it gnawed at her every day. Then came the day that would change everything. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and Maya was walking to her next class when she noticed them. 3 of the teens, walking just ahead of her in the hall. They were laughing loudly, ignoring the few students who were trying to pass by. Maya had learned to avoid them, to take a longer route if necessary just to keep her distance, but today was different. Today she couldn't escape. One of them, a girl named Tiffany, turned around and saw Maya coming. A smirk played on her lips, and she made a show of stepping aside to block Maya's path. Maya had tried to keep her head down, her eyes focused on the floor, but Tiffany wasn't having it. "What's wrong, Maya? Too good to talk to us now," she sneered. Maya didn't respond. She had learned long ago that silence was sometimes the best defense, though it never really worked. Tiffany's smirk grew wider, and she grabbed Maya's books from her arms, throwing them to the ground. "Pick them up, loser," Tiffany said, her voice dripping with malice. Maya froze, but before she could bend down to collect her books, Officer Daniels appeared, walking down the hall as he always did, looking as if he didn't have a care in the world. The teens paused, eyes darting to the officer, and for a brief moment, Maya thought that maybe, just maybe, he would step in. But instead, Officer Daniels stopped, his gaze flicking between Maya and the teens. He gave a small nod, as if acknowledging something he couldn't be bothered to confront, and then turned to walk away. "Come on, Maya," Tiffany called out. "Don't you know how to pick up your own things?" The officer didn't say a word. He didn't even look back. Maya, heart racing, bent down to grab her books, the floor feeling like it was closing in around her. She knew what this meant. Officer Daniels had just made his choice. He had chosen them. But it didn't end there. Maya wasn't the only one who had noticed the officer's response. Another student, Mark, had been standing near the lockers and he saw everything unfold. Mark wasn't friends with Maya, but he had noticed the way the officer had treated her. He had seen the cruelty, the favoritism, and the way Officer Daniels seemed to look the other way every time the teens went too far. Mark wasn't sure what was going on, but he knew it wasn't right. After the incident, Mark started watching closely. He started paying attention to the conversations the officer had with the bullies and the way he interacted with other students. It was subtle at first, but soon it became clear that the officer was always present when these teens were around, offering them advice, even laughing with them. There was something off about it, something hidden beneath the surface. But it wasn't just Mark who had noticed. A few other students had started talking amongst themselves, sharing suspicions, and wondering if the officer was more involved than anyone realized. Whispers turned to rumors, and rumors turned to questions that no one dared to ask out loud. Why would an officer who was supposed to protect the students, especially those who were vulnerable, choose to support those who were making life unbearable for someone like Maya? Was there something deeper, something more sinister, behind his actions? The more the students questioned, the more uneasy they became. No one had answers, but everyone had a theory. Was Officer Daniels simply ignoring his responsibilities, or was he, in some twisted way, protecting the bullies for reasons no one could yet understand. And most importantly, what would happen when the truth finally came out? The days that followed seemed to drag on for Maya. She had always been good at blending into the background, but now she felt as if the entire school was watching her every move, waiting for her to slip up. The bullies seemed to sense her fear, and it fueled their attacks. Tiffany and the others were relentless, taunting her at every turn, their voices loud enough for everyone to hear. It was as if they knew they had the upper hand, because they did. Maya had no ally, no one to back her up, and even the one person who should have been her protector had chosen to look the other way. But what hurt more than the bullying itself was the cold, silent betrayal of Officer Daniels. She couldn't stop thinking about that moment when he turned away, leaving her to pick up the pieces of her life without any support. Maya had hoped, for the briefest of moments, that the officer would stand up for her, that he would take control of the situation and show the bullies there were consequences for their actions. But instead, he had given them permission to continue, with no fear of reprisal. It wasn't just Maya who was feeling the effects of the officer's indifference. Mark, the student who had been watching from the sidelines, couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He had seen the way Officer Daniels interacted with the bullies, always with a smile or a nod of approval. It didn't add up. An officer was supposed to keep order, not condone cruelty. But every time Mark tried to approach the subject with his friends, they shrugged it off, dismissing his concerns as paranoia. It was just the way things worked, they said. The officer wasn't doing anything wrong, they insisted. But Mark couldn't stop the nagging feeling that something deeper was at play. The officer's favoritism towards Tiffany and her friends wasn't random. There was a connection between them that went beyond the usual high school drama. Mark decided to do some digging to see if he could uncover something that would explain the officer's behavior. He started by paying closer attention to the students the officer spent time with. It wasn't long before he noticed something that made his blood run cold. One afternoon, Mark happened to be walking past the parking lot when he saw Officer Daniels talking to Tiffany, the girl who had tormented Maya the most. But it wasn't a simple conversation. The officer was leaning against his patrol car, his body language relaxed, as Tiffany handed him something wrapped in a small, crinkled envelope. Mark didn't have a clear view of what was inside, but he could see enough to recognize the furtive nature of the exchange. Tiffany looked around nervously, as if making sure no one was watching, before quickly slipping away into the school building. The officer didn't even glance over his shoulder before getting back into his car and driving off. Mark felt a chill run through him. It wasn't the first time he had seen the officer with Tiffany, but it was the first time he had seen them so secretive. It didn't make sense. The officer was supposed to be a figure of authority, a person students could trust. But now, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that there was something darker going on, something that linked Officer Daniels and Tiffany in a way he didn't understand. The next day, Mark decided to confront Maya. He hadn't spoken to her much before, but now he felt compelled to tell her what he had seen. She had been avoiding everyone lately, her shoulders hunched in a way that made it clear she was trying to be invisible. When he approached her in the hallway, her eyes widened with surprise, but she didn't flinch or push him away. "Maya," Mark began, his voice low, "I need to talk to you." She looked at him for a moment, her expression unreadable, before she nodded. "What is it?" "I've been seeing things," Mark said, trying to keep his voice steady. "The officer, he's not what he seems. He's always with Tiffany and her friends. And yesterday I saw him. He was talking to her in the parking lot. It looked strange, like they were hiding something." Maya's eyes widened. She had always known that there was something off about the officer, but hearing it from Mark made it feel real. She had always wondered why he hadn't intervened when Tiffany and the others picked on her. Now, it seemed like he might be more involved than anyone had realized. "I knew it," Maya muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. "I knew something was wrong." Mark leaned in closer, his eyes scanning the hallway to make sure no one was listening. "I think we need to find out what's going on. It's more than just bullying, Maya. This officer, he's connected to them somehow, maybe in ways we don't understand yet." Maya felt a knot tighten in her stomach. The thought of confronting Officer Daniels, of uncovering whatever secret he was hiding, terrified her. But at the same time, something inside her told her it was the only way forward. She couldn't keep running. She couldn't keep hiding from the truth, no matter how ugly it might be. "I'm scared," she admitted quietly. "What if we're wrong? What if we make things worse?" Mark gave her a reassuring look. "We won't know until we try. But we can't let them keep doing this. You deserve better than this, Maya." Maya took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. "Okay, let's figure this out. But we have to be careful. We can't trust anyone." The plan was simple, but the risks were high. They would start by gathering as much information as possible, watching Officer Daniels and his interactions with the teens, listening for any whispers or clues that could shed light on his relationship with them. They couldn't act too quickly, couldn't risk blowing their cover. The officer was a powerful figure at the school, and if they made a wrong move, it could cost them everything. But as they began their investigation, they discovered something unsettling. The more they watched, the more the pieces seemed to fall into place, but the picture they were forming was not one they had expected. Officer Daniels wasn't just helping the bullies out of indifference or negligence. He was protecting them for reasons far more complicated than anyone had imagined. And as Maya and Mark began to unravel the threads of the mystery, they realized just how far the officer's influence stretched, and how much danger they were in. The truth was closer than they thought, but it was a truth that would change everything they knew about the school, the officer, and the people they thought they could trust. And the further they dug, the more terrifying the consequences became. Maya and Mark had been careful, watching from the shadows, gathering pieces of the puzzle, but the deeper they dug, the more unsettling the picture became. They had learned to recognize the officer's patterns, the way he would always appear just when Tiffany and her friends were around, the way his eyes would flicker nervously whenever anyone came too close. They started to notice that the conversations he had with the bullies weren't just casual exchanges. There was a tension, a sense of urgency in their voices, as if they were discussing something important, something that couldn't be overheard. It wasn't just the officer they were watching anymore. Maya and Mark began to suspect that the entire school was somehow complicit in what was happening. Teachers turned a blind eye, students whispered behind closed doors, and everyone seemed to know their place in the system of power and privilege that ran beneath the surface. The fear in Maya's chest had only grown with each passing day. They had been gathering small pieces of evidence, notes from Tiffany's locker, overheard conversations, anything that might link Officer Daniels to whatever was going on. But despite their efforts, every attempt to move closer to the truth only felt like a step into more dangerous territory. They had to be careful, had to stay one step ahead of the officer and the bullies. It was like walking on a tightrope, and the slightest misstep would send them plummeting into unknown consequences. One afternoon, as Maya and Mark met in the school library to go over their findings, a new piece of the puzzle landed on their lap. Maya had been doing research on Officer Daniels, combing through old school newsletters and records, when she stumbled across something strange. A photo. A photograph from the last school year's police fundraiser, showing Officer Daniels standing next to Tiffany's father, a well-known businessman in town. They were smiling, shaking hands, looking like old friends. But Maya's stomach dropped as she zoomed in on the date stamped in the corner of the photo, just a few months before the bullying had started. It was the first real connection between the officer and Tiffany's family, and it was a connection that changed everything. Maya's heart raced as she showed Mark the photo. "Tiffany's dad," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "He's more than just a parent. He's connected to the officer. This is why he's been protecting her. This is bigger than I thought." Mark's eyes widened as he stared at the photograph. The weight of their discovery settled over them like a heavy fog. So the officer's not just ignoring it. He's actively covering for her, Mark said quietly, his voice tense. "He's in on it. This whole thing is some kind of deal." Maya clenched her fists, her mind racing. But what's the deal? Why? What could they have promised him in exchange for his silence? The realization hit Maya like a punch to the gut. It wasn't just about bullying anymore. The officer wasn't some passive observer. He was an active participant in a much larger scheme. The bullying had been a smokescreen, a way to distract from whatever hidden agenda the officer and Tiffany's father were orchestrating. Maya could feel the danger closing in, and she knew they had to act quickly before they were caught. That night, as she sat alone in her room, her phone buzzing with messages from Mark, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat, every movement a signal that someone was onto them. The officer's behavior was too calculated, too controlled. He had been following their every move without them even realizing it, waiting for the right moment to strike. The next day at school, the tension was unbearable. Maya and Mark had agreed to meet in the library again to discuss their next steps. But as Maya walked down the hallway, she noticed something strange. Officer Daniels was standing at the end of the hall, his eyes locked on her, and there was no mistaking the way he was watching. The subtle shift in his stance told her that he knew. He knew they had figured it out. Maya's heart pounded in her chest, her legs trembling with fear. She turned and walked quickly toward the nearest exit, hoping to avoid a confrontation. But as she rounded the corner, she came face to face with Tiffany. The girl's usual smug grin was replaced with a look of cold calculation. "You really think you can dig around in places you don't belong?" Tiffany sneered. "You think you can get away with it?" Maya's mind raced. She needed to get out, needed to find Mark, but the threat in Tiffany's eyes made it clear that the game had changed. The bullies weren't just targeting her anymore. They were onto her and Mark, and they had the power to stop them. Maya's breath caught in her throat as Tiffany stepped closer, the smirk still on her lips. "You're messing with forces you can't control, Maya," Tiffany said, her voice low and menacing. "I don't know what you think you're doing, but you're in way over your head." Before Maya could respond, a voice rang out from behind her. It was Officer Daniels. "Tiffany, that's enough." Maya's stomach dropped. She had hoped, maybe foolishly, that she could confront the officer, ask him about what she had discovered, demand an explanation. But now, standing there in front of him, she knew it was too late. The trap had been set. Officer Daniels' gaze moved from Tiffany to Maya, and for the first time, he didn't seem like a man of authority. He seemed like someone who had been waiting for this moment for a long time. "Maya," he said slowly, his voice colder than she had ever heard it, "I don't know what you think you've uncovered, but it's time to leave this alone." Maya's pulse raced. This was the moment. Everything she and Mark had done, everything they had risked, had led to this confrontation. The truth was within reach, but it felt as if it was slipping through her fingers. What would she do now? Was she ready to expose everything, knowing the risks, knowing the consequences? The silence in the hallway felt suffocating. Maya could see the anger in Officer Daniels' eyes, the way Tiffany was standing behind him, arms crossed, as if daring her to make a move. Everything was building to a breaking point, and Maya knew that whatever happened next would change everything. Mark's voice broke the tension as he appeared around the corner, his face pale but determined. "Maya, don't." But it was too late. The officer's hand shot out, grabbing Mark by the arm. "I warned you," Officer Daniels growled. "Stay out of this." But Maya wasn't backing down. Not now. Not after everything they had uncovered. She stepped forward, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. "No, you're not going to get away with this. Not anymore." The battle for the truth had begun, and there was no turning back. Maya stood her ground, heart pounding in her chest as she faced Officer Daniels. She had never felt more afraid, but the truth burning inside her was stronger than her fear. "You can't keep doing this," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper, but the intensity behind it was unmistakable. "You and Tiffany, you're in this together, aren't you? There's something you're hiding, something bigger than all of this." Officer Daniels' grip tightened on Mark's arm, his face now a mask of anger, but Maya didn't flinch. Tiffany, standing behind him, looked smug, as though everything was going according to plan. For a moment, Maya thought she might actually be able to break through, to expose everything they had been hiding. But then the unexpected happened. Officer Daniels released his grip on Mark with a sudden shove, and before Maya could react, a sharp voice echoed down the hallway. "Is there a problem here, Officer Daniels?" Maya turned toward the voice, her heart sinking as she saw the last person she expected. It was the principal, Mr. Harper. The man who had always seemed to stand as the last line of defense for the students, but something in his eyes told her that wasn't the case now. He wasn't rushing to Maya's aid. He wasn't even looking at her. Instead, his gaze was locked on Officer Daniels, and it was filled with an unsettling familiarity. "Not at all, Mr. Harper," Officer Daniels replied smoothly, his voice suddenly calm and controlled, like he had just flipped a switch. "Just making sure the students understand boundaries." He gave a forced smile, one that didn't reach his eyes, before glancing briefly at Maya and Mark. They were getting a little too curious, you know. "It's all under control." Maya's stomach twisted as Mr. Harper nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "I trust that everything is in order then," he asked, though his words felt more like a command than a question. "Of course," Officer Daniels said, straightening up and adjusting his uniform. He turned away from Maya, as though dismissing her entirely. "Everything's fine." But as he and Tiffany began to walk away, Maya caught something in Mr. Harper's gaze. A fleeting moment, a brief flicker of understanding between him and Officer Daniels that made her blood run cold. It was as if they shared a secret, something that neither she nor Mark could possibly understand yet. It was the kind of look that could only be exchanged between two people who had worked together for far too long, who were far too invested in hiding something. Mark leaned closer to Maya, his voice low. "Did you see that? The principal, he's in on it too." Maya's mind was racing. She had suspected there was more going on, but this was beyond anything she could have imagined. The principal, the officer, and Tiffany's father, they were all connected. But how far did this conspiracy go? And what do they want from her? What do they have to hide that was so important? Before she could voice any of these thoughts, a cold realization hit her like a slap to the face. What if they had been watching her all along? What if the reason they hadn't confronted her yet wasn't because they hadn't figured it out, but because they were waiting for the right moment? What if their silence was part of the plan? Her breathing became shallow as the pieces began to come together, but there were still too many gaps in her understanding. Something about this didn't add up, and yet it felt like she was standing at the edge of a precipice, just one step away from uncovering the darkest secret at the heart of the school. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that every action, every decision made by Officer Daniels and Mr. Harper seemed meticulously calculated, as if they knew exactly how she would react. Why would the principal be involved? Maya whispered, more to herself than to Mark. "What's the connection?" Mark's eyes were wide with fear, but his voice was steady. "I don't know, but I think we just uncovered the tip of the iceberg." They had to keep going. They couldn't stop now, not when they were so close to the truth. But Maya knew they had to be even more careful now. There were more people involved than she had ever imagined, and she couldn't trust anyone. Not the officer, not the principal, not even her friends. The conspiracy was much deeper than high school bullying. It was a network, a carefully constructed web of power and influence that reached far beyond the school's walls. As they turned to leave the hallway, Maya's phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, her pulse quickening, as she saw a text message from an unknown number. "Stop digging, or we'll regret it." Asterisk. Her hands shook as she read the message again. This wasn't a warning anymore. It was a threat. "Mark," Maya said, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and determination. "They know we're onto them." Mark looked around nervously, his eyes darting to the door where Officer Daniels had just disappeared. "What do we do now? We can't just let them scare us into backing down." Maya swallowed hard, trying to steady her racing thoughts. "We keep going, but we need to be smarter." We need to find out what they're really hiding and why it's so important for them to keep it covered up. And we need to make sure we have everything we need before we make our next move. One wrong step and they'll have us. The stakes had never been higher, and Maya knew they were teetering on the edge of something much bigger than they had ever imagined. But now, with the threat hanging over them, she could feel the pressure building, and the question at the forefront of her mind was no longer asterisk if asterisk they would be caught, but asterisk when asterisk. And as if to confirm her worst fear, another message came through on her phone, this time with an attachment. A photograph. She opened it, and her breath caught in her throat. It was a picture of her, standing in the hallway, the exact moment she had confronted Officer Daniels. And written across the top in bold letters, asterisk, you're already in too deep. Asterisk. Suddenly, everything felt like it was closing in. The walls were closing in around them, and the truth was slipping further and further out of reach. Maya's heart pounded as she stared at the photograph on her phone. The hallway around her felt eerily quiet, every sound muffled as though the air itself was holding its breath. Mark peered over her shoulder, his face paling as he read the words etched across the image. "They're watching us," he whispered, his voice trembling. Maya swallowed hard, her mind racing. Whoever had sent the message wasn't just threatening them. They were showing how close they were, how deeply entrenched this conspiracy had become. But fear wasn't the only thing Maya felt. Beneath the anxiety was a flicker of anger, a determination not to let them win. They had come too far, risked too much. Backing down now wasn't an option. "We need to go to the source," Maya said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Tiffany's dad. He's the connection between all of this, the officer, the principal, everything. If we can confront him, maybe we can find out the truth." Mark hesitated, glancing nervously down the hallway. "Maya, if they're this close, they could be listening to us right now. What if we're walking into a trap?" Maya clenched her fists, pushing down the fear that threatened to consume her. "We're already in a trap," she said firmly. "The only way out is through." That evening, under the cover of darkness, Maya and Mark made their way to the sprawling estate on the edge of town that belonged to Tiffany's family. The house loomed ahead of them, its windows glowing softly in the night. Every step closer felt like stepping deeper into enemy territory, but Maya refused to let herself falter. She had to know the truth, no matter the cost. As they approached the front door, a sudden movement in the shadows made them freeze. Officer Daniels stepped out from behind a parked car, his face illuminated by the pale glow of a street lamp. His expression was cold, calculated, and for the first time, Maya saw the full weight of the man's role in this twisted game. "You should have stopped when you had the chance," he said, his voice low and menacing. Maya stood her ground, even as her knees threatened to buckle. "We're not afraid of you," she said, her voice shaking only slightly. "We know you're protecting Tiffany, but we also know this is bigger than her. We're not leaving until we get answers." Officer Daniels didn't respond right away. Instead, he glanced over his shoulder toward the house, his jaw tightening. "You think you know what's going on?" he asked, his tone dripping with disdain. "You don't have a clue. Your kid's playing a game you can't win." But before Maya could reply, the front door of the house swung open, and Tiffany's father stepped outside. He was an imposing man, his sharp features illuminated by the porch light. His expression was unreadable as he looked at the scene unfolding in his driveway. "What's all this commotion?" he asked, his voice smooth but firm. Maya didn't wait for anyone else to speak. "We know you're involved," she said, her words tumbling out in a rush. "With the officer, with the principal, you're all working together to hide something, and we're not leaving until we know what it is." For a moment, silence hung in the air. Then, to Maya's surprise, Tiffany's father chuckled softly. "You're more persistent than I gave you credit for," he said, "but persistence doesn't always pay off." He stepped closer, his presence commanding, and gestured for Officer Daniels to stand down. "Let's not make a scene out here," he said. "Why don't we take this conversation inside?" Mark shot Maya a panicked look, but she nodded, her jaw set with determination. This was their chance to get the answers they had been searching for. They'd followed Tiffany's father into the house, their footsteps echoing in the grand entryway. Once inside, Tiffany appeared at the top of the staircase, her arms crossed and a smug expression on her face. "I told you to back off," she said, her voice laced with venom. Her father raised a hand to silence her. "Let me handle this, Tiffany." He turned to Maya and Mark, his eyes narrowing. "You want the truth? Fine, but be careful what you wish for." What he revealed next was more shocking than anything Maya had imagined. The officer, the principal, and Tiffany's father weren't just covering up bullying. They were part of a larger scheme to control the narrative in the community. Tiffany's family's wealth and influence reached into every corner of the town, but then came the twist that made Maya's blood run cold. "You're not here by accident, Maya," Tiffany's father said, his voice dropping to a chilling whisper. "Your family's been in our way for a long time. Your father's activism, your mother's advocacy, it's a threat to everything we've built. And you're just another piece on the board." Maya's breath caught in her throat. This wasn't just about her. It was about her family, her identity, everything she stood for. They hadn't just been trying to silence her. They had been trying to erase her. But as her fear threatened to overwhelm her, something unexpected happened. A voice rang out from the shadows of the room. "You've gone too far this time, Charles." It was Mr. Harper, the principal, but his tone wasn't one of alliance, it was one of defiance. "I kept quiet because I thought it was harmless, but this has crossed the line." The room erupted into chaos as Tiffany's father turned on Mr. Harper, shouting accusations of betrayal. Officer Daniels stepped forward, trying to regain control, but the tension had already boiled over. Maya seized the moment, pulling her phone from her pocket and hitting record. "You're all exposed now," she said, her voice strong and clear. "The whole world will see the truth." As the argument escalated, Maya and Mark slipped out of the house, their hearts racing. They had the evidence they needed, and for the first time, Maya felt the weight begin to lift from her shoulders. The fight wasn't over, but the tide had turned, and as they disappeared into the night, Maya couldn't help but feel a spark of hope. The truth was finally on their side. Maya and Mark ran through the quiet streets, their breath fogging in the cool night air. Every shadow seemed to stretch and reach for them, every distant sound making their hearts race. But despite the fear clinging to them, there was a glimmer of determination in Maya's eyes. She clutched her phone tightly, knowing that what they'd captured could change everything. They reached Maya's house and slipped quietly inside, careful not to wake her parents. Once in her room, they locked the door and sat on the floor, replaying the recording. The voices of Tiffany's father, Officer Daniels, and Mr. Harper filled the small space, their words clear and incriminating. It was proof of everything: the bullying, the conspiracy, the manipulation that had poisoned the school and the community for so long. Mark leaned back against the bed, his face pale but resolute. "What do we do now? This is huge, Maya. Bigger than anything we've ever dealt with." Maya stared at the phone screen, her thoughts racing. "We have to be smart about this. If we release it recklessly, they'll try to spin it. People like them always do. We need to make sure this gets out in a way they can't control." The next morning, Maya reached out to her mother, who was known for her work in social justice and advocacy. As they sat together in the kitchen, Maya explained everything, from the bullying to the connections they had uncovered. Her mother listened carefully, her expression shifting from concern to determination. "This isn't just about you, Maya," her mother said gently. "This is about standing up for everyone who's been silenced. But you're right, it has to be done carefully." With her mother's help, they contacted a local journalist known for exposing corruption. The journalist, a sharp-eyed woman named Carla, was intrigued by their story and agreed to meet with them. At the meeting, Maya and Mark handed over the recording, along with everything they had documented about the bullying and the roles of Tiffany, her father, Officer Daniels, and Mr. Harper. Carla listened intently, her pen flying across her notebook as they spoke. When the recording played, she leaned forward, her face set with a grim determination. "This," she said, "is going to shake this town to its core." Over the next few days, Carla worked tirelessly to corroborate the evidence. She dug into public records, interviewed other students and parents, and uncovered a pattern of corruption that went back years. When the story finally broke, it was explosive. The recording was played on the evening news, the voices of the powerful figures laid bare for everyone to hear. The community reacted with a mix of shock and outrage. Officer Daniels was placed on leave pending an investigation, and the school district announced that Mr. Harper had been suspended. Tiffany's father, facing mounting scrutiny, resigned from several local boards and issued a carefully worded statement denying any wrongdoing. But the damage to his reputation was done. At school, the atmosphere shifted almost overnight. Students who had been too afraid to speak out began sharing their own stories of bullying and mistreatment. Teachers who had turned a blind eye now stepped forward to support the students. The administration implemented new policies to address bullying and ensure transparency, and Maya found herself at the center of a growing movement for change. Tiffany, once untouchable, was no longer the queen of the school. Her peers began to see through her facade, and her influence faded. She avoided Maya and Mark, keeping her head down as the halls buzzed with whispers about her role in the scandal. One afternoon, Maya sat with Mark on the steps outside the school, watching the students bustle around them. The sun was warm, and for the first time in weeks, Maya felt a sense of peace. "We did it," Mark said, breaking the silence. "We actually did it." Maya smiled, though there was a trace of sadness in her eyes. "Yeah, we did, but it shouldn't have taken all this to make things change." Mark nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Maybe not, but sometimes it takes a spark to light a fire." In the weeks that followed, Maya found herself reflecting on everything that had happened. The fight had been exhausting, terrifying, and at times overwhelming. But it had also shown her the power of standing up for what was right, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. One evening, she sat with her parents at the dinner table, the glow of the news playing softly in the background. The anchor was discussing the ongoing investigation into the school and local law enforcement. Maya's mother reached over and squeezed her hand. "You've made a difference," her mother said, pride shining in her eyes. "You've shown people that their voices matter." Maya nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. She had started this journey feeling powerless, a single voice against a tide of injustice. But now, she realized that her voice had sparked something bigger, a movement that couldn't be silenced. As the days turned into weeks, life at school began to settle into a new normal. The changes were slow but steady, and Maya found herself surrounded by allies she hadn't known she had. Students who had once stayed silent now stood with her, united by a shared determination to make their school a better place. One afternoon, as Maya walked home, she noticed a group of younger students playing in the park. Their laughter echoed through the air, free and unrestrained. It was a simple moment, but it filled her with hope. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, she felt like they were on the right path. Maya knew there would always be challenges, always be people who sought to maintain power at the expense of others. But she also knew that change was possible, one step at a time. And as she turned the corner onto her street, the sun casting a warm glow over the neighborhood, she allowed herself to believe that brighter days were ahead. The story might have started with pain and conflict, but it had led to something far greater. It had shown Maya, and everyone around her, that even in the face of injustice, the truth could shine through. And in the end, that truth had the power to change everything.